back to another video. So when I first started growing cut flowers, I assumed that growing the flowers would be the hard part. I never anticipated the challenges that would come from having to learn the proper stage of harvest to cut each and every bloom. I mean, almost every flower variety has its own set of rules in regards to when is the perfect stage to cut. And it can be a lot, you know, trying to learn all those rules and pick flowers at just the right time. But ultimately, knowing when flowers are at their ideal stage of harvest is what is going to help you maximize the vase life of your flowers so that you can either enjoy them yourself for a much longer period of time or so that your customers can enjoy them in their homes for as long as possible. While we all know that cut flowers don't hang around indefinitely, no one enjoys an arrangement that is alive one day and wilts the very next. So before we head out into the garden, let me just mention 3 simple rules that apply no matter what you're cutting. The first is that you're always going to want to harvest into clean buckets that have fresh water in them. If you're harvesting flowers into dirty buckets, there's more of a chance that you'll introduce your fresh stems to bacteria, which will reduce their vase life. Now, the same goes for your snips. You want to make sure that you have clean, sharp snips so that you can make a clean cut. A clean cut is going to ensure that your flowers are actually going to be able to take up water and stay hydrated. Last but not least, it's important to harvest flowers during the coolest parts of the day. Here at Two Sisters Flower Farm, we harvest either early in the morning or late at night, and we really try to avoid cutting our plants during mid-afternoon when the sun is at its hottest. If you're harvesting in your garden, even if you're harvesting directly into water, it can be really hard keeping your flowers from just getting cooked. And so if possible, I really encourage you to try to cut when the temps are a bit cooler. During either those early mornings or late evenings, you'll find that your flowers are more hydrated, so we'll have an easier time, you know, bouncing back after being cut. Okay, so now that we know those rules, let's head on out to the garden. So with a lot of flowers I'm going to show you today, the trick is to pick them before they're fully opened. Now there are a few exceptions to that rule and I'll share that with you later, but really you want to resist the urge to pick flowers that are in full bloom already in the garden because they simply won't last as long. You know, flowers that have already blown open, while they certainly look beautiful now, the problem is that they've likely already been pollinated. Really what we're trying to do is to catch the flowers before they've been pollinated, because once they've been pollinated, that's what's going to signal the plant to start making seed. And once that happens, you'll notice that your flowers' petals, they tend to drop much more quickly, and the flowers just fade much faster. So let's start with one of my favorite summer flowers, and that is sunflowers. Now, we plant a lot of sunflowers here. Each and every week during the summer, we're planting more seeds to hopefully have a continuous flush of blooms all season long. As you can see here, I've gotten a little behind on harvesting, and these flowers, while beautiful as they are, they're really past the point where I'd ideally harvest them. With sunflowers, you're going to want to harvest them as soon as those first petals start to lift off the central disc. For me, I still may sneak a few blooms into some of my arrangements that are a little bit more open, but I'm always looking for blooms that are, you know, still a little bit concave. The petals, once they start reflexing backwards, they're really on their last leg, and these are the types of blooms that I will just leave out in the field. Snapdragons are a favorite of mine. I love their colors and they just add a different shape to mixed bouquets. With Snapdragons, you're going to want to look for flowers where the bottom 1/3 or 1/2 of the spike is open. That's going to give you the longest vase life. You're going to want to cut your Snapdragons deep and close to the ground, leaving just 2 sets of leaves on the plant so that those next stems that shoot up are actually of usable length. Now here's some flowers that are past their prime. As you can see, the petals on the spike are almost fully open and the bottom petals have really started to fade. While the top half of this bloom is beautiful, it's really not going to last long in the arrangement, and as you can see, the blooms just fall off very easily. So one more thing to note about Snapdragons is that they are geotropic, which is a fancy way of saying that they have a strong response to gravity. So if you lay your stems horizontal, or even if you leave them angled in your floral bucket, you'll notice that your stems will curve upward, and you really can't undo this bend once they have it. So always try and keep your stems as upright as possible in your buckets. So either rubber band them together, or make sure that you harvest enough where they can keep themselves upright within your bucket. So let's move on to Luzianthus. I have shared in previous videos that Luzianthus are always a test of patience. They take their sweet time when it comes to growing, and once you finally do see blooms, you have to exercise just a little bit more patience before you cut them. With this flower, it's important to let that first bloom, leave it on the stem and let it fade away. You'll notice once this happens that the other buds on the stem will start to ripen and open too. If you harvest too early before that first bloom is spent, usually what happens is that the other buds don't open. So I always harvest when 2 or 3 blooms are open on a spray. For all their trouble, Luzianthus are incredibly beautiful. And the good thing about this flower is that even though they require mountains of patience, they do last an amazingly 10 to 14 days in the vase, which helps make up for some of that patience that you have to exercise before you get to harvest. So here's an example of a flower that I would go ahead and harvest. It has 2 buds open, meaning that the rest should ripen. As you can see here, I've let this first bloom fade away. It's starting to brown up, and because this is browning up, you'll notice that these blooms right here, these buds are starting to get bigger, and these will in fact open. So I will harvest this here shortly. I'm going to let this flower just fade away for a little bit longer. Now, zinnias are an exception to that rule that I mentioned earlier, where you want to harvest them before they're open. With zinnias, you want to make sure that your stems are ripe enough. And one of the easiest ways to test whether a stem is ripe enough is to do the wiggle test. So here's an example of what a flower looks like that's really beautiful. But if I sway it gently back and forth, do you see how the stem wiggles? This stem is too young to pick. Now if you look at this example over here and we do that same wiggle test, see how the stem and the head is staying intact? This is more of an example of a zinnia that is ready to harvest. With a little practice, you'll learn to recognize when to cut zinnias without having to do the wiggle test every single time and with every bloom. But knowing that little trick is a great way to know if a stem is right for cutting.
So for a lot of the flowers that I've shared, you've seen how it's important to cut them before the blooms are wide open. For foliage, however, it's important to wait until stems are mature and firm. When you pick foliage too young, it often doesn't last long in the vase, and in most cases, it wilts really fast. Here at our farm, we grow a lot of herbs for foliage. I really love having that herb scent within my bouquets. It sort of gives them more of an earthy feeling. A lot of our foliage this year, like our basil, it did get planted quite late. And so right now at the time that I'm filming this video, I don't have an example to show you, but I just want to emphasize it's important to look for woody and firm stems.
Now, before we wrap up this video, there's one more thing worth mentioning in regards to harvesting flowers, and that's the idea of saving blooms. So I know this was true for me, and I'm sure it's true for a lot of you as well, especially if you're just starting out growing cut flowers. But I remember in my early days not wanting to cut from my garden, or I was afraid to cut, especially when I didn't have a reason to. Like I wasn't selling a bouquet to a customer or making one for myself. And I know the tendency can be that you want to save your blooms for when you really need them. But that's not how growing cut flowers works. When you're not regularly cutting from your garden, what tends to happen is that you're signaling to your plants that its job is complete. You know, it's time to set seed and be done. So rather than producing more and more flowers, what tends to happen is that your plants shut down and produce significantly less. There's a saying within the flower farming community that a healthy cut flower garden is one that doesn't have a lot of color. Because as I've mentioned in this video, you're harvesting your blooms before they really have a chance to open. So I can't encourage you enough to regularly cut from your garden so that your plants throw up new blooms and continue to produce all season long. Really make it a habit to cut on a schedule so that you're getting to your plants before they set seed. Here at Two Sisters, we harvest from our garden almost every night, trying to catch flowers when they're just right. And as I'm harvesting, if I see spent blooms, I'm making sure to deadhead those from a plant as well. I promise you, with a little consistency, I think you'll be surprised at just how abundantly your garden will produce. Okay, so I think that about covers it. Now, please do me a favor, if you enjoyed the content in this video, could you give this video a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button below? We'd really appreciate it. Now, I just want to say thank you so much for tuning in, and as always, I can't wait to see you next week in our next video. Bye, guys.